Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to RealFear Files. Today, we travel deep into the heart of New Mexico, the Land of Enchantment, where the blazing desert sun conceals secrets far darker than the night itself. In this episode, we'll uncover 9 of the most unsettling true stories ever to emerge from this mysterious land. These aren't campfire legends or whispered folklore. They are real events, cases examined by investigators, documented in official records, and still unresolved within the files of law enforcement. Every account you'll hear has been carefully pieced together from police reports, forensic findings, and witness testimony. To protect those involved and respect ongoing investigations, some personal details have been changed, but the dreadful truth of what occurred remains exactly as it happened. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to RealFear Files for daily true horror stories that reveal the shadows hiding across America's most haunted corners. Tap the notification bell so you never miss the moment when terror comes knocking. Now, let's begin. On a lonely desert highway, where a discovery was made that no one could have ever imagined. For nearly 3 years, Hunter had driven the same lonely stretch of highway through New Mexico without a single incident. Highway 78, an endless strip of cracked asphalt slicing through the state's southwestern corner near the Arizona line, was as familiar to him as the route from his front door to his mailbox. As a veteran long-haul trucker running overnight routes, he knew every curve by memory, every faded signpost, every flickering bulb of the few gas stations scattered along that barren expanse. By daylight, the highway looked lifeless. Just miles of dry brush, skeletal trees, and the ghostly remains of towns that time had long forgotten. But after nightfall, it changed. The road became an abyss, a corridor of pure darkness, where the glow of your headlights felt like the only proof that the world still existed beyond the void. It was early morning on February 16th, 2:30 a.m., when Hunter first noticed it. A set of red taillights glowing faintly in the distance, unmoving on the shoulder near mile marker 3. At first it barely registered. Cars pulled over all the time. But as he drew closer, something about the stillness made him slow his rig. Hunter was westbound on his usual run between Lordsburg and the Arizona border. The night was bitter, but not freezing, around 38 degrees. And the air was so clear that the desert sky glittered with a million stars, undimmed by the faintest hint of city light. Out here, in this forgotten part of New Mexico, the heavens looked like they belonged to another world entirely. As the truck rolled nearer, Hunter's pulse began to tick up. Details emerged through the wash of his headlights. A dark sedan, later confirmed as a Honda Accord, parked on the gravel shoulder, engine running. He could see heat shimmer rising from the exhaust, bending the air above it. The headlights were on, their glow spilling across the dusty roadside. Through the rear window, the interior dome light glowed softly. And underneath the hum of his diesel engine, Hunter could faintly hear something else. The muffled rhythm of music coming from the car's radio. He eased the rig to a stop about 50 feet behind the vehicle. The massive truck idled, rumbling softly in the cold stillness. Hunter stayed inside for a moment, peering through the windshield, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The scene looked so ordinary, and yet something felt deeply wrong. The car was clearly occupied, lights on, engine humming, music playing, but there was no movement inside. Maybe it was just a breakdown. Maybe the driver had felt ill and pulled over, fallen asleep with the heater running. A dozen harmless explanations cycled through Hunter's mind. But none of them fit the unease crawling up his spine. It wasn't just silence. It was that kind of silence that presses on your chest. That absence of motion in a place that should never feel still. Hunter couldn't quite explain it, but every instinct told him something was off. Maybe it was the isolation. This particular stretch of Highway 78 rarely saw more than a handful of cars between midnight and dawn. Or maybe it was the kind of sixth sense that comes from spending thousands of nights alone on dark roads. The kind that whispers when danger is near. He reached for his phone, then stopped. No signal. There never was out here. The nearest cell tower sat miles away, somewhere near Animus. His eyes flicked to the CB radio, but he doubted anyone would be close enough to hear. The nearest real town, Lordsburg, was more than 40 miles behind him. Arizona lay 18 miles ahead, but that direction only promised more darkness, more desert. Finally, Hunter made up his mind. He grabbed the heavy maglite wedged between his seat and console, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The cold hit him like a slap. That bone-dry desert chill that sucks the moisture from your breath and skin. The music grew clearer now. Some pop station, fading in and out through static, probably from Phoenix. The sedan's engine droned steadily. Exhaust fumes mixed with the sage and creosote scents that always lingered in the desert air at night. Hunter approached slowly, boots crunching on gravel. His flashlight beam swept over the rear of the car. New Mexico plates, no visible damage, no bumper stickers, nothing out of the ordinary. Then he reached the driver's side window and raised the beam. What he saw froze him in place. The driver sat slumped forward, forehead resting against the steering wheel. Male, maybe mid-30s, wearing a blue work shirt with a stitched name patch Hunter couldn't read from his angle. At first, it looked like the man had simply passed out. But then the beam of the flashlight slid across the driver's side window and caught the unmistakable sheen of blood. Not a few drops, a lot. The inside of the glass was speckled and smeared, the dark stains glistening under the light. Thin rivulets had run down the pane, drying into black trails. Hunter's breath hitched. He stumbled back, gasping. He forced himself to look again. From where he stood, he could see 3 neat wounds on the back of the man's head. Later, investigators would confirm what Hunter already suspected. 3 close-range gunshots from a small-caliber weapon, likely a .22 or .25. The grouping was precise, deliberate, too exact to be a crime of impulse. This had been an execution. Hunter's stomach lurched. He backed away, heart pounding, thoughts fragmenting in panic. He had to get help. Someone. Anyone. But there was no signal, no phone, no nearby town. The only sign of life for miles was an abandoned gas station 12 miles behind him, and even that probably had no working line. Then a new fear struck him, a colder, sharper one. Whoever had done this might still be out here. He hadn't seen another car in nearly 40 minutes, but that didn't mean the killer wasn't close. They could be sitting in the dark somewhere, engine off, watching. They could be crouched in one of the gullies along the highway, waiting to see if anyone would stop. Hunter bolted back toward his truck, every nerve screaming. He slammed the door, locked it, and started the engine. His hands trembled as he grabbed the CB microphone. The radio's range wasn't great, 10, maybe 15 miles on a clear night. But it was his only shot. "Breaker, breaker," he said, his voice shaking. "This is westbound on Highway 78 near mile marker 3. I've got an emergency. I need law enforcement immediately. Does anyone copy? Over." Static. Nothing. He tried again. And again. Each time his voice grew more desperate. Then, finally, a faint crackle broke through. "This is eastbound driver near Animus," a voice said. "Copy your distress call. What's your situation? Over." Relief hit Hunter so hard he almost cried. He forced his words out as clearly as he could, describing what he'd found. The other driver promised to contact authorities as soon as he reached town, about 25 minutes away. 25 minutes. Hunter drove forward, pulling ahead of the blood-stained sedan. He wanted distance between himself and that horror. 2 miles later, he stopped again, angling his truck so he could watch both directions of the road. Engine running, doors locked, he waited. It took 38 minutes for help to arrive. He saw the flashing lights first, red and blue cutting through the blackness. 2 vehicles, a Hidalgo County Sheriff's Cruiser and a New Mexico State Police unit. Hunter flicked his headlights in signal. The officers parked beside his rig. One was older, gray at the temples, eyes sharp from years on the job. The other barely out of training. Hunter gave his statement right there on the shoulder, voice trembling but steady enough to recount what he'd seen. The deputies called for backup, then headed toward mile marker 3. Against their advice, Hunter followed at a distance. Something compelled him, maybe disbelief, maybe the need to confirm that the nightmare was real. By sunrise, Highway 78 was no longer empty. Patrol cars, forensics vans, and news crews dotted the shoulder. The once silent stretch of road had become a full-scale crime scene. By the time the sun climbed over the desert horizon, Highway 78 near mile marker 3 looked nothing like the empty road Hunter had known only hours earlier. The flashing lights of patrol cars strobed against the sand and brush. Yellow tape fluttered in the cold wind. Investigators moved methodically between vehicles, marking evidence, photographing the scene, and speaking in low voices. A medical examiner had driven in from Las Cruces before dawn. Forensic technicians from the state crime lab arrived from Santa Fe after a 3-hour trek. Even agents from the FBI's El Paso field office showed up before noon, drawn by the location's proximity to the Arizona border and the possibility that this might cross state lines. The dead man was soon identified. His name was Hunter Alexander, 34 years old, a mechanic from Silver City. He had been driving home after visiting his sister in Lordsburg. When the name came over the radio, Hunter, the trucker, felt a chill that reached his bones. They shared the same first name. A small coincidence, yet somehow it made the whole thing feel even more personal, as if fate had called out to him that night. The autopsy confirmed what Hunter had already suspected. 3 gunshots, close range, small caliber, all to the back of the head, no signs of a struggle. The shots had been deliberate, tight grouping, clean entry points. Whoever pulled the trigger had done so with calm precision. This wasn't a carjacking, it wasn't a robbery. The victim's wallet remained in his back pocket with $217 in cash. His expensive wristwatch was still strapped to his arm. Nothing was missing, nothing disturbed, except for his life. Investigators combed through the car inch by inch. There were no fingerprints other than the victim's own. No trace of another person's DNA. Not even a discarded shell casing. The killer had taken the time to collect them before vanishing into the night. The radio was still tuned to a Phoenix pop station, volume set low. The engine ran smoothly. The gas tank was 3/4 full. A to-go coffee cup sat in the console, half empty, its contents long gone cold. The receipt showed it had been purchased 2 hours earlier at a Chevron in Lordsburg, helping narrow the timeline. Based on temperature and the blood's condition, the medical examiner placed the time of death between 1:30 and 2:30 a.m. Probably closer to 2. The killer had struck less than half an hour before Hunter the trucker passed by. But the most unsettling question wasn't when the crime happened. It was why the victim had stopped. The car showed no signs of mechanical trouble. No flat tires, no engine issues. No reason to pull over in the middle of nowhere. The seat position suggested the victim had been sitting normally, hands likely on the wheel, not turning or reaching. That meant he hadn't been surprised by something outside. He'd stopped willingly. Investigators considered two possibilities. Either the killer was already in the back seat, hidden, waiting, or the victim had pulled over for someone he trusted enough to offer a ride. Both scenarios pointed to premeditation. Both required a level of control and confidence that chilled even the seasoned detectives at the scene. The case grew colder with each passing day. Leads evaporated. Tips led nowhere. There were no witnesses, no cameras, no tracks in the sand that could be traced. Whoever did it had planned perfectly, leaving nothing behind. The FBI classified it as a possible targeted killing, but could find no motive that fit. Hunter Alexander had no criminal record, no known enemies, no debt, no secret life. Just an ordinary man driving home on an ordinary night. Until he wasn't. Months turned to years. The file grew thicker, filled with interviews, analysis, and reports that all came to the same conclusion. No suspect, no closure. The New Mexico State Police Cold Case Unit still reopens the file each year, hoping that new forensic techniques might uncover something overlooked, some tiny clue invisible to the technology of the time. But so far, the evidence has stayed silent. As for Hunter, the trucker, the man who stumbled across the nightmare that night, he tried to move on. He finished his run that morning, dropped his cargo in Arizona, and returned home a day later. But the image of that car, the blood on the glass, the soft music echoing through the desert, refused to fade. He took the same route 3 more times in the following weeks. Each trip felt heavier, slower, as if the road itself remembered. Finally, he asked for a different route. Any route. As long as it didn't take him near Highway 78. Even now, years later, he still drives nights. Still watches the stars streak past above endless miles of blacktop. But when dispatch sends him near the Arizona border, he plans carefully. He fills up early. He checks his lights, his tires, his gauges. And if he ever has to take Highway 78 again, he makes one unbreakable rule. He does not stop. When he passes mile marker 3, he keeps his eyes fixed ahead, hands tight on the wheel, trying not to think about that February night. Not about the faint music on the air, or the still-running engine, or the man slumped over the wheel with 3 perfect holes in his skull. Some questions never find answers. Some roads never give back what they take. And still, Highway 78 runs on, cutting through the desert like a wound that never heals. Travelers speed past the marker without a second thought, unaware of what happened there. Unaware that the darkness between those towns isn't empty at all. It waits. Because in the endless quiet of the desert, you learn one thing. The silence out there isn't peace. It's something watching, something listening, something waiting for another pair of headlights to slow, for another good soul to pull over when they shouldn't. And when they do, the desert will swallow the noise, just as it always has, leaving only the wind, the sand, and a question that will never be answered. The celebration next door began promptly at 8 p.m. on July 28th. It was midsummer in northern New Mexico, and the air still held the warmth of the day, hovering around 80 degrees Fahrenheit as the sun sank below the horizon. The sky deepened into rich purple, dotted with the first faint glimmers of stars. For Jonathan, 16 years old, the night felt entirely ordinary. He had no work obligations and intended only to enjoy himself. There was nothing in his behavior, his gait, or his interactions with others at the gathering to suggest this would be his final evening spent among peers. Jonathan lived with his family in Española, a small town nestled in Rio Arriba County, roughly 45 miles north of Santa Fe. Española carried a layered history, economic hardship and opportunity, entwined in ways that left visible marks on the community. Empty storefronts, neglected properties, and the shadows of past struggles hinted at long-standing issues, including drug abuse and generational poverty. Yet, there were also families who worked tirelessly to carve out stability and security, despite the challenges. Jonathan's own neighborhood reflected both sides of this reality. The home hosting the birthday party was a short walk from Jonathan's residence. Neighbors later estimated it to be under a mile away, possibly around 3/4 of a mile. For a teenager familiar with the streets, it was a walk of roughly 15 to 20 minutes. Heading home on foot after the celebration seemed perfectly natural to Jonathan. At 16, he was old enough to navigate the neighborhood alone, and the path was familiar and straightforward. During the party, several attendees noticed a small cut on Jonathan's head. It was minor, superficial enough that it didn't warrant medical attention, but visible. Multiple guests commented on it, and Jonathan explained that he had sustained the wound earlier that day. It did not appear to cause him discomfort. He moved among friends with the same energy and engagement he always displayed, chatting, laughing, and participating in group activities as if nothing were amiss. The cut seemed trivial, the type of minor scrape typical for a teenager. As the evening wore on and midnight drew near, Jonathan decided it was time to leave. He said goodbye to those around him and told the host he was heading home. No one suggested giving him a ride. It had never occurred to anyone that he would need one. He was capable of walking the short distance, and the route was generally safe for someone his age. Between roughly 11:30 p.m. and midnight, Jonathan departed. The next verified sighting occurred at approximately 2:40 a.m., when a driver heading north on State Road 68, the main route through the Española area, noticed a figure lying in the roadway. The motorist pulled over and confirmed the presence of a young man sprawled across the southbound lanes, apparently unconscious, or worse. Emergency services were called immediately, and first responders arrived within minutes. Jonathan was found on the pavement just north of town, in a spot that made the severity of his condition immediately clear. He had sustained massive head trauma. The injuries were not consistent with a simple fall or minor accident. They reflected significant blunt force, suggesting repeated impacts or a high-speed collision. Paramedics worked urgently to stabilize him and rushed him south to UNM Hospital in Albuquerque, an hour-long drive. The medical team fought to save him, attending to catastrophic damage to his head and brain, but it proved impossible. Jonathan never regained consciousness and was pronounced dead at 2:23 p.m. on July 29th, less than 15 hours after being discovered. The mystery lies in the gap between midnight and 2:40 a.m., a span of 2 hours and 40 minutes. During this interval, Jonathan traveled roughly 2.5 miles from the party to the location where he was found. How that journey unfolded, what events occurred along the way, and why he ended up on the highway remain unknown. The New Mexico State Police's Criminal Investigation Division took the lead. Detectives interviewed party attendees, aiming to reconstruct every detail of Jonathan's actions before he left. They spoke with family members to learn about his day, any conflicts, and his social connections. They meticulously examined the scene where Jonathan was discovered, seeking evidence that could indicate whether a vehicle had struck him or if someone had attacked him. A critical obstacle emerged from the autopsy results. The medical examiner could not determine conclusively how Jonathan sustained fatal trauma. It was possible that a vehicle collision caused the injuries, but the same trauma could have resulted from repeated blunt force, delivered by one or more individuals. The extent and nature of the damage fit multiple scenarios. Consequently, the examiner officially classified the manner of death as undetermined. This lack of specificity created a substantial challenge for investigators. If a vehicle were responsible, police needed to search for damaged cars, broken vehicle parts, or other evidence. They would interview drivers, check repair shops, and examine traffic patterns during the critical hours. If instead, Jonathan had been assaulted, a different investigative path was necessary. Identifying potential attackers, reviewing his social relationships for conflicts, and looking for weapons or other signs of a violent encounter. The indeterminate autopsy forced law enforcement to pursue both avenues simultaneously, stretching resources thin and leaving fundamental questions unresolved. Partygoers reported that Jonathan had shown no signs of distress or conflict at the gathering. His behavior was consistent with normal teenage energy, relaxed, cheerful, and engaged with friends. Beyond the minor head cut noted earlier in the evening, no injuries were observed. Yet, the timeline held critical gaps. If Jonathan had walked straight home, he would have arrived within 20 to 30 minutes. Instead, he was found 2.5 miles away on the highway at 2:40 a.m., severely injured. Several possibilities arose. Did Jonathan leave the party intending to go somewhere else? Had he accepted a ride from someone he knew? Was he abducted, or did he encounter a vehicle accident? With no witnesses during the missing hours, investigators were left to conjecture. The case eventually went cold. No suspects emerged, no arrests were made, and no definitive explanation was ever established for how Jonathan ended up on State Road 68 in a state that proved fatal. It remains open in the New Mexico State Police Cold Case Homicide Unit, stored in a file that grows thicker with time but thinner in prospects for resolution. For Jonathan's family, the uncertainty inflicted a unique and enduring pain. If a driver had struck him and admitted responsibility, there would have been closure through the justice system, even partially. If an assailant had been identified and prosecuted, at least accountability and understanding could follow. Instead, the ambiguity left a void, a limbo in which the truth of his death remained hidden. The undetermined manner of death meant that somewhere, someone may have known what happened. Whether through accident, violence, or misfortune, someone carried that knowledge and chose not to reveal it. The location on State Road 68 provided no additional clues. The highway continued to carry traffic as before, unaware of the tragedy that had occurred. Most drivers had no idea a 16-year-old boy had lost his life there during the hours of darkness. What is certain? Jonathan left a party around midnight, likely planning to walk home. Somewhere along his route, he encountered circumstances that inflicted catastrophic head trauma. By the time he was discovered, the injuries were too severe to survive. How and why it happened, and whether another party was responsible, remains a mystery. The minor laceration on Jonathan's head, observed at the start of the night, pales in comparison to the damage he suffered later. The difference between those injuries represents lost hours, missing witnesses, and truth that may never surface. Jonathan's case became part of the cold archives, a story relegated to a liminal space where unresolved deaths linger. Every July, as the anniversary of his passing arrives, his family confronts the same injustice anew: the absence of knowledge, of clarity, of closure. A wound that refuses to heal fully because the source of trauma was never identified. State Road 68 continues to wind through Espanola. Its surface appears unchanged from that fateful night in July. Yet Jonathan's story remains, recorded in files, remembered in hearts, and preserved in memory as a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the profound consequences of unanswered questions. Jonathan's death is one of New Mexico's enduring enigmas, a story without an ending, a question with no answer, a mystery that may never be solved. The unanswered questions surrounding Jonathan's final hours became a constant shadow over his family. Every moment of silence, every unexplained gap felt like a fresh injury. Friends and relatives struggled with the what-ifs, replaying the night over and over, imagining scenarios that might explain how a lively, healthy 16-year-old could end up fatally injured so close to home. The not knowing, more than the event itself, gnawed at them, leaving a raw and persistent ache that never faded. Investigators returned to the highway repeatedly, hoping to spot any overlooked clues. Tire marks, disturbed gravel, traces of blood on roadside vegetation. Anything that could illuminate the path Jonathan had taken. But the landscape offered nothing. The stretch of State Road 68 where he was found remained unremarkable to casual observation. No hidden turns, no secluded spots. Just the same asphalt lined with scrub and sagebrush. It was as if the events of that night had left only Jonathan behind, and nothing else. Law enforcement attempted to reconstruct possible scenarios using witness statements and local knowledge. They considered that Jonathan might have been wandering for some unknown reason, perhaps disoriented, and accidentally stumbled into the path of a vehicle. Alternatively, they explored the possibility of an intentional attack, a confrontation with someone who had waited for an opportunity, or a chance encounter that escalated fatally. Every theory seemed plausible, yet none could be confirmed. The lack of physical evidence made each potential narrative equally credible and equally frustrating. The idea that someone might have been involved, someone who had interacted with Jonathan during those missing hours, remained hauntingly plausible. If a driver struck him, whether intentionally or accidentally, that individual might have driven off without realizing, or caring, what had happened. If a person or persons assaulted him, they might still live in the community, carrying the knowledge of their actions silently, whether out of fear, shame, or indifference. The notion that someone could hold such critical information, yet never speak it, left investigators grappling with the psychological weight of anonymity and concealment. Jonathan's peers, those who had attended the party, struggled with their own questions. They recalled his casual demeanor, the way he laughed, how he wandered from group to group, seemingly oblivious to danger. They could not reconcile the image of the cheerful social teen with the scene discovered hours later on the highway. Conversations replayed endlessly. Did someone see him leave with someone? Had he been following a new acquaintance? Was there a hidden moment of conflict that no one else noticed? Each memory became a tiny piece of a puzzle, with missing pieces too vital to ever see the full picture. The local community, too, carried the echoes of that night. Parents spoke quietly to each other about the fragility of teenagers walking alone after dark. Neighbors became more cautious, sharing advice about travel safety and checking in with each other's children. The tragedy, while intensely personal to Jonathan's family, rippled outward, altering behavior, attitudes, and the sense of safety within a town already marked by uncertainty and hardship. The cold case file itself became a monument of unfulfilled questions. Every page added, interview transcripts, autopsy reports, investigative notes, served as a reminder that more was known than could be acted upon. Every lead that failed to bear fruit reinforced the reality that time, once past, could never be regained. Detectives documented theories with meticulous care, yet they remained theories. No witness accounts tied to concrete evidence, no confession, no accidental discovery of the missing hours. The narrative was frozen, incomplete, and infuriatingly stubborn.
For Jonathan's family, anniversaries became a bitter marker of loss and limbo.
Each year, they revisited the memory of the boy who left a party, full of life, only to be found hours later on a quiet stretch of highway. The absence of answers prevented traditional mourning, leaving a persistent, unresolved grief. Their reflections were not just about Jonathan's life, but about the injustice of the unknown, the cruelty of circumstances that deprived them of clarity and closure. Law enforcement periodically reviewed the file, as new technology or database updates sometimes offered fresh avenues for investigation. DNA analysis, vehicle registrations, and criminal history checks were revisited, hoping for a breakthrough. Each examination, however, confirmed the coldness of the trail. There were no new sightings, no recorded evidence, nothing to definitively link a suspect or scenario to the fatal injuries. Time, instead of revealing secrets, seemed to reinforce the impermeability of the mystery.
The physical environment of that stretch of State Road 68 remained unchanged, a silent witness to events that could never be explained. Cars passed as if nothing had happened, drivers unaware of the tragedy etched into the pavement decades earlier. The landscape retained the same scrub, the same roadside brush, the same dim glow from distant lights. To the casual observer, it was an ordinary road. But to those who knew Jonathan's story, it was a reminder of loss, of time suspended in uncertainty, of a life ended under circumstances that might never be understood.
What remains undeniable is the timeline of events. Jonathan left a neighborhood gathering around midnight, likely planning a simple walk home. He did not arrive as expected. Hours later, he was found severely injured, and no one could provide a clear explanation for what had occurred in that intervening time. The nature of his injuries, the minor cut he carried from earlier in the day, and the contrast with the catastrophic trauma he ultimately suffered, represent a window into those lost hours. Hours that might hold answers forever hidden from view. The case exists now as both memory and record, a document of absence as much as presence. It preserves the knowledge that a life ended violently, without explanation, and without justice. The unknown perpetrator, if there was one, remains a phantom in the community. The highway continues to carry travelers, and the landscape offers no testimony beyond what is recorded in police reports and family memories.
Jonathan's story, unresolved, is a testament to fragility and the opaque nature of tragedy. It is a reminder that even in ordinary surroundings, walking home after a party, familiar streets under a summer night sky, life can be irreversibly altered. The lack of closure compounds grief, extending it indefinitely. It is a void not easily filled, a question without a definitive answer, a mystery that may remain eternally unresolved. The record of Jonathan's death endures in the cold case files of the New Mexico State Police, cataloged and preserved, but unresolved. Each anniversary renews the sense of injustice, each reflection, a reminder of questions unanswered. State Road 68 continues its path through Espanola, unchanged, yet forever marked by what happened on that night. Jonathan's family holds on to his memory, enduring the limbo of uncertainty, living with the persistent ache of not knowing. The tragedy stands as a permanent testament to a life cut short, and a story that remains one of New Mexico's unsolved mysteries. The ranch house rested across hundreds of acres, blending into the rolling hills and arid mesas of central New Mexico in such a way that it seemed almost like a natural part of the terrain, rather than a structure built by human hands. To reach the property, one had to leave the main highway and follow a winding gravel driveway that meandered through open rangeland.
passing scattered barns, sheds, and corrals before arriving at the home itself. It was a place defined by solitude, where neighbors were few and far between, where privacy was nearly total, and where one could live for decades without crossing paths with another person unless they deliberately sought human contact. Aaron and his wife were the residents of this remote home. They had built their life around the land, establishing a quiet existence that revolved around the rhythms of ranch life, tending to animals, maintaining the property, and managing the demands of rural living in New Mexico. Both were diligent in their work, attentive to the upkeep of their ranch, and mindful of the details that allowed life in such isolation to function smoothly. To outsiders, they seemed ordinary, decent, law-abiding citizens. People passing through town might never notice them, unaware of the quiet lives they led far removed from the social currents of everyday community life. Yet, on the night of November 13th, their peaceful life would be shattered in a way so shocking that it would remain a haunting mystery for decades. On that evening, Aaron and his wife were at home. By all appearances, the night was typical, ordinary in every way, the kind of night that passes unnoticed in countless households across the country. But unlike most evenings, this night would not fade into memory. Sometime during the late evening or early night hours, the couple was killed. Both were shot in their home, the violence hidden from immediate discovery. The scene was not found immediately. It would be several days before anyone realized that tragedy had struck. When the bodies were eventually discovered, the crime scene investigators noted key details that distinguished this event from a random act of violence or a robbery. Most notably, there were no signs of forced entry. The doors were intact, the windows unbroken, and the lock showed no indication of tampering. This fact alone indicated something far more disturbing. It suggested either that Aaron and his wife had voluntarily allowed the intruder into their home, or that the perpetrator possessed a key and intimate knowledge of the property sufficient to enter undetected. Either possibility pointed to the same grim conclusion. The killers were not strangers. The victims had known the person or persons responsible, or at the very least, they had felt comfortable enough to allow them access to the house in the late hours, when people are most vulnerable. Once inside, the assailants acted with calculated precision, taking the lives of both Aaron and his wife with firearms in a manner that investigators later described as a methodical execution, rather than a spontaneous act of rage or opportunistic crime. The investigation began immediately, with the New Mexico State Police Criminal Investigation Section taking the lead. County law enforcement assisted, meticulously documenting the scene, preserving evidence, and analyzing every piece of potential information. The weapons were recovered and scrutinized. Every aspect of the house was examined for clues, fingerprints, or anything that might connect a suspect to the murders. Investigators left no detail unrecorded, considering every potential lead and every angle that might point to those responsible. Yet the case ran into immediate complications. Despite the meticulous examination, no clear suspects emerged. Aaron and his wife had no known enemies. Their neighbors had no disputes with them. Their financial records showed nothing unusual. There was no evident motive that would explain the lethal targeting of the couple. The most likely candidates, the people who had sufficient familiarity to enter the home without breaking in, offered no leads. They had alibis, lacked access to firearms, and had no apparent reason to commit murder. The investigation expanded, pulling in forensic specialists from across the state. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was enlisted to assist, as often happens in serious rural homicides, where local resources might be insufficient to process a complex case. Hundreds of interviews were conducted. Detectives pursued every tip, chased every theory, and followed every thread that could lead to a suspect or reveal a motive. Yet, despite exhaustive effort, the investigation stalled. By December 1984, approximately 1 month after the killings, a grand jury convened under the 12th Judicial District Attorney's Office to review the evidence and determine whether probable cause existed to press charges. Investigators presented their findings, forensic reports were analyzed, and the grand jury examined every facet of the case. No indictments were returned. No one was charged. The case remained unresolved, though the grand jury issued a recommendation. The investigation should continue. This advice, while not legally binding, indicated that the grand jury recognized suspicious circumstances, behavior, and potential leads that might one day yield results. In September 1985, roughly 10 months after the murders, the case escalated further. The New Mexico Attorney General joined forces with the state police to conduct a joint inquiry into the deaths. This elevated the investigation, bringing additional expertise and resources to bear, and signaling that there were suspected individuals or lines of inquiry that warranted high-level attention. Even with these combined resources, state, federal, and forensic, the case could not be solved. Despite weeks of intense effort, no arrests were made, and no individual could be tied definitively to the crime. Time passed. Witness recollections faded. Evidence deteriorated. The trail, fresh and viable in November 1984, grew colder with each passing year. The case transitioned from an active investigation to a cold case, maintained in the archives of the New Mexico State Police Cold Case Unit. Occasionally, breakthroughs occur when witnesses come forward years later, or when forensic technology advances enough to reveal what had been hidden. In this case, however, none of these developments transpired. The investigation languished, and the deaths of Aaron and his wife remained a haunting enigma. What can be definitively stated is that Aaron and his wife were killed in their home by someone they trusted enough to allow entry. Someone who moved through their property with the ease of familiarity. Someone who, in a single night, executed 2 human beings in cold blood. Who that person, or persons, was remains unknown. The motive remains unknown. Whether the killings were driven by personal vengeance, financial interest, interpersonal conflict, passion, or a calculated intent lost to history is still a matter of conjecture. Forensic analysis, ballistics, trace evidence, and crime scene investigation has failed to identify a match to any suspect. Decades have passed. The property where the murders occurred may be occupied today, either by new residents oblivious to the violent history of the home, or abandoned, a silent monument to a tragedy that never found resolution. The recommendation of the investigative grand jury to continue examining the case has never resulted in actionable outcomes. No new indictments have been issued. No arrests made. The case remains in the limbo of cold case status, a place where unsolved murders reside after all leads are exhausted and time erodes hope. Somewhere, it is believed, someone knows the truth. Someone remembers the events of November 13th. Who entered that ranch house, and why Aaron and his wife were killed. That individual may have relocated far from the scene, perhaps living in another state or country. Or they may have passed away themselves, taking their secret to the grave. Alternatively, they could remain in New Mexico, moving undetected through communities, unburdened by law, yet silently carrying the knowledge of the crime they committed. Aaron and his wife's deaths remain unresolved. Their lives ended violently, and their story persists only in the records maintained by law enforcement, in the archived files of the Cold Case Unit, and in the recollections of those who investigated the crime without ever uncovering answers. Yet for the perpetrator, if still alive, the mystery is not in the past.
They carry the truth of that night, the actions, the intent, the knowledge of what was done, hidden from the public, unchallenged, and unpunished. The case of the ranch murders stands as a stark reminder of the fragility of life, the hidden dangers that may exist even in the most remote and serene places, and the enduring pain inflicted on the families and communities left behind. The landscape of central New Mexico remains unchanged in many ways. The mesas, the gravel roads, the wide expanses of solitude. Yet the ranch house, whether still standing or replaced, remains a silent witness to a violent night and the secrets that time has failed to reveal. The murders, carefully executed and meticulously planned, suggest a level of calculation that heightens the horror of the crime. The lack of forced entry, the familiarity of the perpetrator, and the complete absence of motive that investigators could identify leave a narrative of deliberate concealment. Whoever committed these murders acted with foresight, understanding the vulnerability of their victims, and ensured that no immediate discovery would occur. They left behind only fragments of evidence, carefully orchestrated to avoid leaving a clear trail. Despite advances in investigative methods, forensic science, and decades of continued oversight by law enforcement, no breakthroughs have been sufficient to bring charges or arrests. The case is emblematic of many cold cases, where the combination of elapsed time, faded memories, and incomplete evidence prevents justice from being served. Yet the file continues to exist, quietly maintained in state archives, a reminder of the violence that occurred and the lives that were stolen. Aaron and his wife's story, while incomplete, remains a powerful testament to the dangers of trust misplaced, the consequences of unseen motives, and the haunting persistence of unresolved crimes. The ranch house, the weapons, the evidence collected, and the preserved scene all stand as silent witnesses to what happened on November 13th, a night that forever altered the landscape of their lives and left an indelible mark on the consciousness of those investigating the crime. In the end, someone knows. Perhaps they carry the weight of guilt. Perhaps indifference shields them. Their identity, their motives, and the complete truth remain inaccessible to the world. Time has passed, seasons have changed, but the events of that night remain frozen in the memory of the land, the house, and the files held by the cold case unit. Aaron and his wife's deaths are unresolved, their lives and their murder lingering in the space between what is known and what remains hidden. A mystery that has endured for decades and may continue indefinitely. Cerrillos Road in Santa Fe was a place where everyday life and commerce intertwined seamlessly. The street buzzed with the rhythm of daily activity, lined with shops, eateries, and the familiar assortment of businesses that make up the lifeblood of any town's commercial stretch. During daylight hours, the street thrived with motion. Cars weaved in and out of parking spaces. Pedestrians moved between storefronts. There was noise. There was illumination. There was the constant hum of human presence, each individual absorbed in their daily routines, visible and active under the open sky. It was in the parking lot of a small variety store along Cerrillos Road that Hazel F. was last seen alive. The date was August 16, 1984. The afternoon was bright, the air sharp with altitude, the sun gleaming fiercely off the pavement. Hazel had entered the store, a modest, independently owned shop typical of mid-sized New Mexico towns before the rise of national chains. What transpired next would vanish into obscurity. Did Hazel spend long inside? Did she buy something? Did she meet someone within the store? Or did some incident prompt her to leave, never to return to her car? These details would never be recovered. What is certain is that at some point that afternoon, Hazel departed the store's lot and was never again observed alive by anyone who would later report it to the authorities. Initially,
Hazel's absence did not ignite a vigorous investigation. She was an adult, presumed capable of navigating her own life decisions. Adults disappear for many reasons. Sometimes choosing to travel, sometimes to step away from the routines of life for personal reasons. A missing adult, absent signs of violence, does not prompt the same immediate police urgency as a missing child might. Yet, as hours stretched into days, Hazel did not return. No eyewitnesses saw her after she left the lot. She failed to reach out to relatives. She did not show up at her home. She missed work and other obligations that structure daily life. With passing days, concern deepened. It became clear that Hazel's disappearance was unlikely voluntary. Authorities began investigating. Detectives interviewed friends and acquaintances, attempting to construct a profile of her life, her social circles, habits, and vulnerabilities. Financial records were scrutinized for irregularities that might hint at foul play or a sudden decision to abandon her life. Hospitals and emergency clinics were checked for admissions matching her description, in case injury had prevented communication. Her car was searched for, and missing person alerts were issued. Despite these efforts, tangible leads remained scarce. There were no obvious suspects. No apparent motive emerged. The nature of her disappearance from the store lot did not indicate a violent abduction. Witnesses reported nothing unusual. The parking lot offered no trace of struggle or assault. The investigation faltered. Days slipped into weeks, and weeks into months. The initial wave of energy and focus gradually ebbed, diverted to other pressing cases. Hazel's absence slowly faded from public consciousness, relegated to the category of open but stagnant investigations. Then, months later, the discovery that transformed Hazel's status from missing to confirmed homicide occurred. Her remains were located in a culvert, a drainage channel running under the terrain south of her family's ranch along U.S. Highway 285, near the town of Lamy. The culvert lay roughly 1 mile south of the ranch, concealed in a remote stretch, invisible from the road or nearby vantage points. The remains were positively identified as Hazel F. Her death was confirmed. Her body had been left in the culvert, a location chosen to evade casual discovery. The placement suggested the perpetrator had knowledge of the area, understanding that the culvert offered at least temporary concealment. The autopsy revealed the cause of death. Hazel had been strangled, the instrument of death being her own bra. The intimacy of this detail implied someone who had been close to her, someone who had time to remove or partially remove her clothing, someone willing to maintain prolonged physical contact, someone who planned rather than killed in a fleeting moment of rage. With a confirmed homicide, the investigation reignited with intensity. Detectives now had concrete evidence and specific questions. Where did Hazel meet her killer? When exactly did the murder occur? How had she been transported from Cerrillo's Road to the culvert? What was the motive? Yet the evidence, though confirming murder, did not point to a suspect. There were no witnesses of Hazel's final movements, and no physical clues definitively identified the killer. Whoever committed the crime had been cautious, leaving minimal forensic traces. Investigators pursued every possible lead, interviewing friends, looking into known criminals, reviewing her social interactions for risk factors. Yet, one by one, each lead failed to produce results. The investigation seemed to spiral back to its core question. Hazel had been murdered, but by whom remained a mystery. Over time, the energy of the investigation waned. Resources shifted to more immediate cases, leaving Hazel's file open but largely dormant. She became a cold case, a victim whose killer remained unidentified and unpunished. The way Hazel died suggested a perpetrator who was methodical, someone comfortable with violence, someone willing to engage closely with a victim and plan carefully to conceal the act. Strangulation with her own bra indicated an intimate, deliberate act, rather than a random or opportunistic attack. The location of her remains, roughly 40 miles south of Santa Fe, meant transportation was required. Hazel's vehicle was never recovered, leaving two possibilities. She had left the lot willingly with someone, or she had been forcibly taken by a person with access to a vehicle and the ability to move her undetected. The culvert itself offered clues. Unlike a buried site, it suggested haste, limited resources, or indifference toward eventual discovery. Yet it was not entirely obscure. Someone who placed her there had prior knowledge of the spot. Decades have passed since Hazel disappeared from the parking lot. Her death now spans longer than the lifetimes of many people. Her killer, if still living, has avoided justice for all these years. Her family has had decades to grapple with absence, to ponder the unknown details of her final hours, and to mourn not just her death, but the failure of justice. The culvert continues to serve its mundane function, channeling water as it always had. Passers-by remain unaware of its grim history, unaware that a young woman's life was stolen there, unaware that someone bears knowledge of this crime. Hazel remains a cold case, cataloged within New Mexico State Police cold case homicide files. Periodic reviews occur, occasional reinvestigations are conducted, and the case is mentioned in discussions on historical homicides. Yet no arrests have ever been made. No suspect has been charged. The individual responsible has never faced trial. Hazel's story endures in fragments. A summer day, a small variety store, a missing person report, and the grim confirmation of her death. Her murder remains unpunished, her killer unknown. The culvert south of Lamy stands as a silent testament to a crime unsolved, a place where the darkness of human action lingered long after the sun set, where justice failed, and a life was stolen without explanation or retribution. Thomas P. was a retired educator and rancher. He had devoted decades to teaching, shaping young minds, and contributing meaningfully to his community. But upon retirement, Thomas sought a different life, one rooted in the land. He wanted the quiet labor of ranching, tending animals, and existing apart from the bureaucratic entanglements that had dominated his professional life. His ranch was isolated, set away from towns, requiring miles of travel along rural roads to reach any commercial center. It was a space for solitude, far removed from the daily bustle of society. On December 30th, the day before New Year's Eve, Thomas had errands in town. He gathered supplies to host a small celebration at his ranch, stocking provisions and preparing to welcome friends and neighbors to ring in the new year. The occasion was one of anticipation and community connection, a bright note amid the quiet of his remote lifestyle. Thomas loaded his vehicle with groceries and hay, embarking on a familiar journey home along roads he knew intimately. But on this routine drive, something changed. Thomas was ambushed. The attack was neither random nor opportunistic. It was calculated, executed with precision. His assailants anticipated his movements, understanding his habits and knowing exactly where to intercept him. Thomas was murdered along the route to his ranch. His vehicle remained at the scene, as did the hay and groceries he had purchased. Silent evidence that he followed his usual routine, unaware of the danger awaiting him. The murder shocked the community. Thomas had no criminal connections, no ties to drugs or organized crime, nothing to suggest he should be targeted.
His death seemed senseless, random, and incomprehensible. Authorities investigated vigorously, and the case drew attention from national media, including the television program America's Most Wanted, designed to appeal to the public for leads that could solve unsolved homicides. Local newspapers and TV stations also reported extensively, circulating his image and details of the murder, asking anyone with information to come forward.
Despite the publicity, investigators found no clear suspects. No arrests were made. The case went cold, remaining a mystery for decades. What was known was that Thomas had been intentionally targeted. The location of his death was not arbitrary. It was the road leading to his home, a path he traveled consistently. Whoever killed him knew his schedule, his habits, and his patterns. The perpetrator was either someone familiar with Thomas personally, or a careful observer who had studied him to strike at the optimal moment.
If the killer knew Thomas, the motive might have been personal. Disputes over property, financial disagreements, or interpersonal conflicts. Investigators interviewed family, neighbors, and acquaintances, examined finances, and searched for potential disputes, but found none. The alternative, that someone had meticulously observed him, suggested a predator selecting a victim based on vulnerability and opportunity. Yet Thomas did not appear to be part of a broader series of attacks. He seemed to be a singular target. Years passed, decades passed, and the New Mexico State Police Cold Case Homicide Unit maintained the file, reviewing evidence periodically and hoping for breakthroughs in forensics or new witness testimony. None arrived. The New Year's Eve celebration he had planned never occurred. The groceries and hay went unused. Friends and neighbors never gathered at his ranch. Instead, Thomas's life ended abruptly on a quiet road, his death unexplained, and his killer unknown. For those who loved him, the injustice of his unsolved murder remained a burden. For the surrounding community, it was a reminder of the unpredictability of violence. For law enforcement, it was a case that eluded resolution, despite resources, skill, and national attention. The road where Thomas died continues to exist, traveled by others unaware of its history, unaware that an educator and rancher was slain there. His murder remains unsolved, his death unavenged. The files of the Cold Case Homicide Unit preserve his story, a record of violence and mystery that time has not clarified. Thomas P.'s case endures as a symbol of unsolved crime in New Mexico. It demonstrates that not all killers are caught, that not all victims receive justice, and that tragedy can strike even the most ordinary lives. A quiet road, routine journeys, and ordinary intentions became the setting of an extraordinary injustice. His murder remains unresolved, a cold case, and a reminder of the darkness that can intrude upon everyday existence. Rising from the heart of central New Mexico, Tomei Hill stands as a sentinel over the surrounding landscape, a landmark steeped in cultural and spiritual meaning for the peoples who have called this region home across centuries. Nestled in Valencia County, not far from the small community of Belen, the hill has long served as a sacred place, a site of ritual and reverence for the indigenous communities who first understood its significance. Centuries ago, before European explorers and settlers arrived, the hill was recognized as a locus of spiritual power, a point where the natural and the supernatural were thought to intersect. Ceremonies were held here, rituals meant to honor forces beyond the immediate world, to seek guidance, to commune with spirits or ancestors. Those who approached the hill with proper respect and knowledge accessed a connection that outsiders could scarcely comprehend. Even after colonization and the imposition of European systems and structures, Tomei Hill retained its importance. It continued to draw people seeking prayer, contemplation, and contact with something beyond themselves. Yet even sacred places, as revered as they are, exist in the physical world and are therefore susceptible to intrusion, violation, and harm. They are not isolated from danger. Their sanctity does not shield them from human cruelty. On the evening of December 9th, as daylight waned and the world shifted toward night, something tragic occurred near this revered landscape. Claire P. was found shot to death close to Sand Hill Road, in an area that overlooked both the valley below and the commanding presence of Tomei Hill. The location was remote, far enough from homes and commercial areas to ensure privacy, but close enough to the hill that the collision of violence and spiritual significance intensified the sense of desecration. It remained unclear whether Claire had been killed on that spot or transported there after being shot elsewhere. The timing of her death was equally uncertain. Was she shot moments before discovery, or had she been killed hours earlier and left in the shadows of the landscape? Investigators arrived quickly, documenting the scene and collecting forensic evidence while beginning the painstaking task of understanding Claire as a person. Her life, her routines, her relationships, and any circumstances that might have led to her murder in this isolated location near a sacred landmark. Claire was a local, hailing from Belen, a small town only a short distance from where she was discovered. She was not a stranger passing through, but a member of the community whose absence would be deeply felt by those around her. Her death resonated within the tight social networks characteristic of small towns, among neighbors, friends, and family. She was someone known, someone whose murder rippled through her community with shock and sorrow. The remoteness of the site, however, posed a significant challenge to investigators. There were no surveillance cameras, no businesses with security systems, and no nearby residents likely to have witnessed the crime. The seclusion meant that whoever placed Claire's body there could do so without being observed. The uncertainty of when she had died compounded the difficulty, as investigators struggled to reconstruct a timeline of her final movements. The question remained, had she been murdered at that location, or had she been transported there afterward? If the latter, the perpetrator would have needed a vehicle and the capability to move her body to a location chosen for its isolation, and perhaps also for its symbolic resonance near a sacred site. Detectives pursued leads through Claire's personal life. They spoke to acquaintances, friends, and family, looking for conflicts or tensions that might have motivated someone to harm her. They examined her financial and personal records and checked for any involvement in risky behavior or criminal activity. Nothing emerged. Claire appeared to lead an ordinary life, engaged in the everyday routines and concerns of a young woman in a small community. There was no apparent motive for her death. Investigators also explored broader possibilities. They considered whether Claire's murder might connect to other unsolved homicides in the region, whether it was part of a pattern of serial predation, or whether her death could be linked to organized crime, drug trafficking, or other criminal enterprises. Yet each of these paths produced no concrete leads. The environment itself became a factor. December in central New Mexico is harsh, with night temperatures often plunging below freezing. Claire's body had been left exposed to the cold, a further indication of the killer's disregard. Whether the act was born of calculation, indifference, or a moment of impulsive rage, it was clear that the perpetrator left her in a location where she could eventually be found, indifferent to the exposure and risk of discovery. Years have passed, and the investigation remains unresolved. The case continues to exist within the files of the New Mexico State Police Cold Case Homicide Unit. But without new leads, progress has been slow and limited. Claire's death did not capture widespread media attention at the time. She was not abducted in a way that drew national focus, and her disappearance did not immediately signal foul play. She was simply found dead near a site of spiritual importance, and the reasons for her death remain unknown. For Claire's family, the passage of time has only compounded the pain. They have no answers. They do not know whether the killer acted out of personal motives, or whether Claire was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. They do not know if the perpetrator was someone within her community, or a stranger who passed through. Each day, each year, they live with the questions unanswered, the uncertainty persistent. The landscape where Claire's body was found continues largely unchanged. Roads remain passable for those wishing to traverse them. The terrain around Sand Hill Road remains accessible. Tomei Hill still dominates the horizon, its spiritual presence enduring despite the violent act nearby. Yet for those aware of Claire's fate, the area is marked forever by her death. A site where human cruelty intersected with sacred space. The choice of location invites speculation. Perhaps the proximity to the sacred hill was intentional, a further desecration meant to amplify the act. Perhaps it was chosen for its remoteness, for the privacy it offered, with no symbolic consideration intended. Either way, the juxtaposition of violence and sanctity remains stark. Claire P's death has become a cold case. Her murder remains unsolved. No suspects have emerged. No one has been formally charged. The case exists as a dormant file, a record of a life stolen, and a tragedy never explained. The sacred nature of Tomei Hill persists, its power seemingly undiminished despite the violence nearby. Visitors continue to approach the site with reverence, unaware of the dark history that unfolded in its shadow. For Claire's family and those who knew her, the location along Sand Hill Road will always bear the memory of her murder. A place where ordinary life collided with extraordinary violence. The hill, the valley, and the road remain, silent witnesses to an unresolved crime. A crime that continues to echo across the years. Claire's case remains emblematic of the unresolved tragedies that punctuate New Mexico's landscape. Years have stretched into decades, yet the answers remain elusive. Every investigation reopened, every file examined by the Cold Case Homicide Unit, has yielded little more than the frustrating awareness of how little is known about what truly happened that night near Sand Hill Road. The questions persist, as sharp and unsettling as the day her body was found. Who took her life? Why? Was it someone she knew? Someone who had harbored resentment or jealousy? Or was it a stranger, acting without a personal connection yet guided by opportunity and knowledge of the area? The lack of witnesses has been a constant barrier. The remoteness of the location offered the perpetrator both concealment and control. No sounds of struggle were reported, no lights seen moving along the road. The area, while not entirely untraveled, is sparsely populated. Residents are few and traffic is intermittent, especially in the evening hours when Claire was likely killed or discovered. This quiet seclusion created the perfect conditions for someone to commit a violent act with a near certainty of not being observed. The circumstances surrounding her body added layers of uncertainty and speculation. Being found outdoors in the open, exposed to the cold December air, could indicate a variety of things. Perhaps it was a hurried disposal, where the killer had no plan beyond leaving the body where it could remain hidden until found. Perhaps it was meant as a message, a deliberate act to shock or disturb anyone who might come upon it. Or perhaps the choice of location was guided purely by pragmatism, a place that was accessible, but not immediately obvious to casual passers-by. Investigators, even decades later, have considered every angle. Claire's personal life was scrutinized thoroughly. Friends, family members, neighbors, and co-workers were interviewed, seeking any signs of conflict or motivation. Financial records were examined, but nothing suggested disputes or unusual behavior. There was no evidence she had been involved in illegal activity, no sign of threats or harassment, No clear reason for someone to want her dead. Claire's life, in every tangible way, was ordinary. Yet that ordinariness makes the brutality of her death all the more stark. Detectives also looked beyond her immediate circle, considering broader patterns of criminal behavior. Was this murder connected to a larger pattern? Could Claire have been one victim among others, a link in a chain of violence that had escaped detection? Were there signs that organized crime, narcotics, or other illicit enterprises were involved? Each avenue ultimately produced no leads. The murder remained isolated, an inexplicable act of violence with no apparent connection to anything larger. The spiritual significance of the hill nearby adds a haunting element to the crime. Tomei Hill is not merely a geological formation. It is a symbol, a site of enduring reverence, a place that generations of people have approached with respect and ritual. The juxtaposition of Claire's violent death against this backdrop deepens the sense of violation. Sacred spaces, meant for reflection and communion with something greater, were rendered silent witnesses to a human act of cruelty. For those who understood the hill's meaning, the murder is more than a simple crime. It is an intrusion into a sacred continuum, a desecration of both life and place. Yet the hill itself endures. Its presence remains unchanged by human acts, its spiritual significance unaffected by violence. Visitors still climb its slopes, still leave offerings, still find moments of reflection in its shadow. Life around the hill continues, with people attending to daily routines, moving through their communities, living in the landscape that has been shaped by generations of history. But Claire's death casts a subtle shadow over the area, a reminder that even the most sacred places are not immune to the intrusion of human darkness. The passage of time has done nothing to clarify the circumstances of her murder. Modern forensic techniques have advanced significantly, and yet, in Claire's case, no breakthrough has surfaced. Evidence collected at the time has been preserved meticulously, but nothing has revealed the identity of the person responsible. No witness has come forward, even years later, with information that could illuminate the truth. The case remains dormant, waiting for a spark that might revive the investigation, a detail, a confession, or some other form of insight that is yet to appear. Claire's family continues to live with the void left by her absence. The uncertainty gnaws at them, a persistent ache that no passage of time has eased. They have no answers about who took her, no understanding of the motives or circumstances. Every day brings the same questions. Was this someone she knew? Someone in her community? Or a stranger whose choice to commit violence was random and unexplainable? They carry the burden of unknowing, and each unanswered question compounds the grief that began the day her body was discovered. The site of her death has become both a memory and a marker. Sandhill Road remains a functional route, part of the rhythm of daily life in the area. People drive past, perhaps unaware of what occurred there. Tomei Hill continues to rise, imposing and eternal. Its slopes dotted with markers, footprints, and rituals that connect the present to centuries of spiritual significance. But for those who remember Claire, for those who loved her, the location is indelibly etched with tragedy. It is a place where violence intruded upon the ordinary and the sacred alike. The case of Claire P. also highlights the challenges of investigating crimes in remote locations. Without witnesses or surveillance, without immediate evidence pointing to a suspect, law enforcement faces immense obstacles. Years of inquiries, interviews, and forensic examinations have yielded little. Each new lead, each review of the evidence, has brought the same realization. The perpetrator remains unidentified. It is a stark reminder of the limits of justice, of the many cases where human cruelty goes unanswered. The silence around the investigation does not diminish the significance of Claire's life. She was known. She was cared for. She mattered to her community. The lack of resolution is not a reflection of her importance, but rather a reflection of the difficulty inherent in solving crimes that leave so few traces behind. Her story is a testament to both the fragility of life and the persistence of human mystery, where questions may linger for generations.
The sacred power of Tomei Hill, while unbroken, now exists alongside a human memory of violence. For some, the hill remains purely a place of spiritual reflection. For others, it is a site tinged with sorrow, a location where a young woman's life was stolen and her death remains unexplained. The duality of the site, both sacred and tragic, serves as a reminder that even places devoted to reverence cannot entirely escape the reach of human cruelty. Despite the passage of decades, Claire P's case continues to occupy the archives of the New Mexico State Police Cold Case Homicide Unit. The file remains open, though largely inactive, a testament to an unresolved tragedy. It is a record of a life abruptly ended, a crime that has left its questions unanswered, a narrative suspended in time. The landscape, the roads, the hill, these continue unchanged, while the human story of loss and the pursuit of answers persists in memory and investigation alike. Somewhere, the knowledge of her murder exists. Someone knows who was responsible. Whether that person carries guilt, remorse, or indifference is unknown. Yet that knowledge remains locked away, invisible to the world, but painfully tangible to those who continue to seek justice for Claire. The hill itself retains its spiritual essence, unbroken, yet forever framed by the memory of her death. Claire P's murder has become part of New Mexico's tapestry of unsolved cases, a narrative of life taken without explanation, of justice deferred indefinitely. The location near Sandhill Road, close to a sacred landmark, remains a quiet, enduring testament to both human fragility and the persistence of unanswered questions. Her death remains unresolved, a story without closure, a chapter in the history of the region marked by sorrow, mystery, and the unresolved tension between violence and the sacred. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of late summer day in New Mexico that carried an almost tangible clarity, where the sun painted the world with sharp, vibrant detail, and the air was warm without being oppressive. The sky held a pale blue brightness, streaked faintly with wisps of cloud, lending the landscape a crisp, defined quality. Skylar, 19 years old, lived with her family in the small community of Belen, a quiet area within Valencia County, roughly 35 miles south of Albuquerque. Her life followed a routine familiar to many young adults: school or work, social time with friends, and hobbies that provided structure and focus. One of those hobbies was cycling, something she did almost daily. On this particular morning, she set out for her usual ride, mounted on her bicycle with practiced ease, heading south along State Road 47. The route was so familiar to Skylar that she could navigate it almost instinctively, recognizing each curve, each incline, each straight stretch as if they were etched into muscle memory. Sometimes her mother accompanied her, sharing in the joy of the ride. But today Skylar rode alone, determined to enjoy the quiet of the morning on her own. She left the family home around 9:30 a.m., planning to return before noon in order to prepare for an afternoon tennis session with her boyfriend, scheduled to start at 12:30. But Skylar never returned. When noon passed and there was no sign of her, her mother's concern quickly escalated to alarm. She drove along State Road 47, scanning the familiar route for any sign of her daughter, but the road yielded nothing. Skylar's bicycle was absent, and there was no trace of her presence anywhere along the path she traveled every morning.
Panic rising, her mother returned home and called the authorities. Investigators arriving at the scene soon discovered fragments of evidence scattered along the highway. Skylar had been carrying a Sony Walkman, the kind of portable cassette player popular at the time, and components of it were found strewn along the road. A cassette tape, torn and mangled, lay nearby. These remnants painted a grim picture. It became immediately clear to police that Skylar had not simply taken a leisurely ride or stopped by a friend's house. Something had gone terribly wrong. The evidence strongly suggested that she had been forcibly taken from her bicycle by someone she encountered on the road. The search for her was launched immediately, with law enforcement coordinating with volunteers from the community. The New Mexico State Police became involved, and soon the story of the young woman who vanished on a clear morning captured regional attention. Skylar's disappearance was alarming not only because of the suddenness of it, but because of the ordinariness of her routine. A healthy, cautious young woman riding along a well-traveled route should not simply vanish. Yet that is exactly what had happened. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, with no new clues beyond the fragments of her Walkman and the absence of her presence. Each passing day magnified the mystery. Parents across the state spoke quietly among themselves about the dangers that even the most ordinary environments could conceal. Conversations about vigilance and safety became common, reflecting the deep fear that Skylar's case inspired. 9 months later, in June of 1989, an event occurred that transformed the investigation in ways no one had anticipated. A Polaroid photograph surfaced in Port St. Joe, Florida. The image depicted a young woman bound and gagged inside what appeared to be the back of a van. Tape covered her mouth, and beside her, a young male could be seen. The date on the photograph suggested it had been taken after Skylar's disappearance, implying that she had been alive for some time following the initial abduction. The revelation electrified the investigation, introducing the possibility that Skylar had been transported hundreds, perhaps over 1,000 miles, from New Mexico to Florida while in captivity. However, the photograph's authenticity proved difficult to confirm. The FBI scrutinized the image, examining every possible detail: fingerprints, potential DNA, the van itself, and the environment depicted. Despite the effort, the image's resolution and quality prevented definitive identification. While the young woman bore a resemblance to Skylar, investigators could not assert with certainty that it was her. Without confirmation, the photograph represented both hope and frustration, a potential lead that might or might not have been relevant. Over the ensuing decades, other similar photographs would emerge, each showing young people bound or otherwise restrained. These images were investigated thoroughly, but every analysis returned the same inconclusive result. Each photograph seemed to depict abduction or captivity, yet none could be definitively linked to Skylar or any other known missing person. As the years passed, Skylar's parents aged under the weight of uncertainty. Grandchildren came into the family who would never know their aunt. Time and change moved forward, but her disappearance remained frozen in ambiguity. In 2008, nearly 2 decades after the incident, a startling development occurred. Sheriff Rene Rivera of Valencia County received a tip that purported to explain the disappearance. According to the information, 2 teenage boys, acquaintances of Skylar, had accidentally struck her with a pickup truck while she was riding along State Road 47. In panic, they allegedly killed her to cover up the incident. The report accounted for her injuries and suggested a motive for her disappearance. Sheriff Rivera publicly stated that he knew the identities of the individuals involved and claimed to possess information confirming the account. Yet the critical obstacle remained. Skylar's body had never been recovered. Even with the information Sheriff Rivera had received, there was no physical evidence to substantiate the claim. No remains were found to confirm the cause of death or corroborate the circumstances described.
Without this evidence, the legal system would not allow charges to be filed. Sheriff Rivera could not arrest anyone, nor could he advance a prosecution. The knowledge of what allegedly occurred remained locked away, inaccessible to Skylar's family and the public alike. Skylar's stepfather voiced strong objections, insisting that circumstantial evidence should be sufficient to justify an investigation and potential charges. He advocated for disclosure of the information Sheriff Rivera had, for naming suspects, and for pursuing justice despite the lack of physical remains. However, the legal framework offered no recourse. Without tangible evidence, the case could not proceed. In 2013, a special task force was formed to re-examine the disappearance. Investigators reanalyzed the original evidence, interviewed witnesses, and attempted to uncover new leads. Technological advancements, particularly in forensic science, offered the promise of breakthroughs. Yet the task force struggled to identify actionable evidence. Despite years of work, no arrests were made, and the case remained unresolved. Then, in 2021, the investigation appeared to advance. Law enforcement issued a statement indicating that a new lead had emerged. A court had authorized a sealed warrant for a private residence within Valencia County. The details of the warrant, the nature of the evidence, and the identities of any individuals involved were all classified, accessible only through judicial oversight. The statement suggested movement in the case, hinting that new information might finally lead to resolution. Yet the public, Skylar's family, and outside observers remained largely in the dark. Finally, on June 13, 2023, after more than 34 years, law enforcement provided an update. The Valencia County Sheriff's Office held a press conference where Sheriff Denise Vigil announced that authorities had gathered enough evidence to submit the case to the district attorney for review of potential charges. Persons of interest had been identified, and evidence had been collected. Yet, in accordance with legal protocol, the identities of those involved and the specific details of the evidence remained sealed, unavailable to the public and to Skylar's family. Throughout all of this, the mystery of Skylar's disappearance endures. On September 20th, 1988, a young woman set out for a bicycle ride along a quiet stretch of New Mexico road and vanished. Her Walkman was found broken, her bicycle never recovered. A Polaroid photograph emerged months later, potentially showing her alive but in captivity, yet the image could not be confirmed. Decades passed with no arrests, no charges, and no resolution. Only recently has there been official recognition of potential progress, though details remain hidden behind sealed documents, confidential warrants, and judicial restrictions. The truth of what happened to Skylar remains shrouded in uncertainty. Someone knows what occurred, perhaps individuals who were involved or who witnessed it. Whether out of fear, guilt, or deliberate concealment, that knowledge has remained silent for more than 3 decades. For her family, the years have been filled with a mixture of hope, frustration, and grief. Living in the liminal space between despair and the faint possibility of justice. The road along which Skylar disappeared continues to exist as it did in 1988, unchanged, but forever marked by her absence. Vehicles traverse it daily, unaware that a young woman once vanished from this stretch of asphalt. The mystery of her fate casts a long shadow, preserved in case files, photographs, and the memories of those who loved her. Skylar's story is emblematic of the fragility of life and the enduring pain of uncertainty. A narrative suspended between hope and loss, known yet unknowable, unresolved yet ever present. Skylar remains missing, her fate unconfirmed, her captors or assailants unidentified and uncharged. Her story exists in the gap between investigation and resolution, between the possibility of answers and the permanence of silence. Though law enforcement continues to pursue leads,
the case remains in the balance, caught between decades of inaction and the faint glimmer of potential closure. The bicycle, the Walkman, the photographs, they all serve as haunting reminders of a life interrupted, of justice deferred, and of the unanswered questions that linger across generations.
Her disappearance, which began on a bright September morning in 1988, is now a historical puzzle, stretching over 34 years. The evidence, although substantial in fragments, remains incomplete. The official narrative acknowledges movement, but the details are hidden, leaving Skylar's family and the public with the ongoing torment of uncertainty. Somewhere in Valencia County, the truth of what occurred rides silently alongside the lives of those involved, as yet unrevealed, awaiting the day when justice may finally emerge from the shadows. Skylar's case, in all its decades-long complexity, is a stark reminder of the enduring pain caused by unresolved disappearances. The human need for closure, for understanding, and for accountability remains unfulfilled. The road she traveled that September morning continues to stand as a silent witness, the broken Walkman as a relic of that moment, and the Polaroid as a symbol of hope, fear, and enduring mystery. Her story is etched into the consciousness of the community and the annals of law enforcement, a haunting testament to the passage of time and the persistence of unanswered questions. The investigation continues, now supported by modern forensic methods and decades of accumulated knowledge. Each step forward must navigate the complex interplay of evidence, legal procedure, and the unyielding passage of time. Yet for Skylar's family, the essential truth remains the same. She vanished on a clear September morning, and for more than 34 years, the circumstances of her disappearance and the identities of those responsible remained concealed, leaving an enduring void in their lives in the public record. Los Lunas is a small community tucked within Valencia County, south of Albuquerque, occupying that familiar space between rural expanses and suburban development that characterizes much of New Mexico. It is the kind of town where people seek refuge from the hustle of city life, yet still retain convenient access to the amenities of larger municipalities. Over the decades, Los Lunas has evolved, but its essence has remained. A place where neighbors often know one another, where daily life moves at a gentler pace, and where residents maintain a balance between privacy and community connection. On a chilly day early in winter, tragedy struck this quiet town. Within a private residence, 2 people were shot and fatally wounded: Charles R. and Paisley M. Law enforcement arrived on the scene following what was officially classified as a call for an aggravated assault, though public records provide limited clarity on who contacted authorities, whether a resident, a neighbor, or another observer reporting the commotion. What is known is that when officers reached the home, Charles and Paisley were both critically injured from gunshot wounds. Emergency services responded quickly, likely transporting the victims to the University of New Mexico Hospital in Albuquerque, a facility equipped to handle severe trauma. Despite the urgent care they received, the injuries proved unsurvivable. Charles and Paisley succumbed within hours of arrival, despite the efforts of medical professionals who fought to stabilize them. From the outset, the case was treated with the gravity of a double homicide, and investigators moved swiftly to secure the scene. Forensic teams meticulously documented the home, gathering evidence that might reveal the sequence of events and the identity of the perpetrator. Detectives began examining the lives of the victims, looking into their routines, relationships, and circumstances, trying to understand why someone would commit such violence in the sanctuary of their own home. Early findings suggested a crime of intimacy rather than randomness. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing indicated a burglary or a home invasion by strangers. Instead, The evidence pointed to a more personal act, one that implied the victims had allowed someone into their home whom they trusted, at least enough not to fear immediate danger.
Both Charles and Paisley had been shot multiple times. The distribution of wounds, the number of rounds fired, and the proximity of the shots all suggested a deliberate intent to ensure the deaths of both individuals. This was not a single impulsive act born of panic or sudden rage. It was an effort calculated and forceful, demonstrating that the killer, or killers, were determined to complete their grim task. The firearms used were never recovered. Investigators collected shell casings and other traces of ballistic evidence, but the weapons themselves remained elusive. Whether they were removed by the perpetrator, hidden nearby, or discarded elsewhere is unknown. From the outset, the investigation faced obstacles. While the scene of the crime and the identities of the victims were known, the culprits remained unidentified. The absence of forced entry implied a familiar assailant, but this clue offered no clear suspects. Detectives interviewed family, friends, and acquaintances of Charles and Paisley, exploring potential disputes, financial disagreements, romantic entanglements, or any personal conflict that might provide a motive. They examined bank records, traced professional and social connections, and performed background checks on those who regularly interacted with the victims. Yet no definitive lead emerged. The murders seemed senseless in their extremity, with no apparent reason for someone to shoot both victims multiple times in their home. Investigators also explored potential links to criminal activity. They considered whether Charles or Paisley might have been involved in illicit dealings, drug conflicts, or dangerous associations that could provoke lethal retribution. No such connections were found. Both individuals appeared to have led ordinary lives, unentangled in patterns of behavior that typically attract violence. Their age and standing suggested maturity and stability, underscoring the disproportionate nature of the aggression they endured. As time passed, the case began to cool. Initial leads were exhausted, and no new evidence emerged. Months turned to years, and the investigation remained unresolved. Despite the diligence of law enforcement, the identity of the person, or persons, responsible for the deaths of Charles and Paisley remained shrouded in mystery. The precise circumstances surrounding the initial response are partly unclear in public records. Whether authorities were summoned through a 911 call, by a neighbor, or by some other alert mechanism is not definitively known. What is certain is that the victims were found alive enough to be transported for emergency care, yet their injuries were too severe to survive. The dual nature of the crime offered investigators multiple avenues for evidence collection. 2 sets of defensive marks, 2 opportunities to gather DNA, fibers, or other materials that might link a suspect to the scene. But even these opportunities did not yield a resolution. While Los Lunas is not as isolated as other locations where violent crimes have occurred in the region, the home's location provided a measure of privacy. The town's character, a balance of familiarity and distance between neighbors, meant that gunfire within a residence might go unheard, or at least unreported, until someone chose to intervene. Whether the 911 call came from the victims themselves, if they had the presence of mind to report the attack, or from a witness remains uncertain. If either Charles or Paisley managed to call for help, they could have provided identifying information about the shooter, but no such record is available in the public domain. Despite the abundance of potential evidence from the dual victims, the case remained unresolved. Investigators worked tirelessly, periodically reviewing and re-examining every lead, yet no suspect ever emerged. The murders became a cold case, an unresolved chapter in New Mexico's long list of unsolved homicides. The residence where Charles and Paisley were killed continued to exist,
whether inhabited by new occupants, left vacant, or perhaps altered over time, does little to change the stark reality. Two people were taken violently in their own home, and the individual responsible has never been held accountable. For the families, the lack of closure has been an enduring burden. They are left with persistent uncertainty, an ambiguity as painful as the loss itself. They do not know whether the perpetrator was known to Charles and Paisley, whether this was an act of passion or premeditation, whether it was random or calculated. The file in the New Mexico State Police Cold Case Homicide Unit remains, growing thicker over time, filled with forensic reports, witness interviews, and investigative notes, yet offering no closer resolution. Each review reaffirms the enduring mystery. Charles and Paisley's story remains a somber reminder of the fragility of safety, the unpredictability of violence, and the limitations of justice when evidence proves elusive. Somewhere, the truth of that winter day exists in someone's memory. Someone knows the identity of the shooter, the motive behind the attack, the sequence of events that led to two lives being extinguished in their own home. Whether that knowledge is carried with remorse, guilt, or indifference is unknown. The case remains unresolved, the murders unsolved, and the questions unanswered. Charles and Paisley's deaths remain a stark example of violence that strikes unexpectedly, leaving no explanation, no justice, and only enduring grief. The town of Los Lunas itself continued its quiet existence after that terrible winter day, largely unaware of the depth of the tragedy that had unfolded within one of its homes. Life carried on for neighbors who had not been directly involved, maintaining the slow rhythms of small-town routines. Children walking to school, residents tending their yards, neighbors exchanging casual greetings. Yet beneath the surface, the shadow of that double homicide lingered, a quiet unease that only those intimately connected to the victims could feel. The property where Charles and Paisley had been murdered remained a focal point for investigators, but in practical terms, it was just another house along a stretch of residential streets. It might have been sold, reoccupied, or even left abandoned. The physical space endured, indifferent to the violent events that had taken place inside its walls. Still, for the families, that house was forever marked. It was a place of loss, grief, and unanswered questions. A place where ordinary life had been shattered with extraordinary force. Investigators returned periodically to the case, reviewing evidence with the cold-eyed patience characteristic of long-term homicide work. Each new development in forensic technology offered a glimmer of hope that perhaps some overlooked detail could finally provide a breakthrough. DNA analysis, ballistics, and pattern recognition were all re-examined, but no solid leads ever emerged. Every investigative path led only to dead ends, reinforcing the sense of helplessness that often accompanies cold cases. As years passed, the narrative of Charles and Paisley's murders became a quiet story, known mostly to family, law enforcement, and the occasional journalist covering unresolved crimes. The broader community continued its life, largely unaware of the intimate horror that had taken place behind closed doors. Yet for the people who loved the victims, the passage of time brought no relief. The absence of answers meant living with perpetual uncertainty, the inability to identify the person responsible, to understand why this had happened, and to reconcile with the thought that the killer might never be caught. The absence of resolution transformed the story into more than a crime. It became a testament to the arbitrary nature of violence and the fragility of safety in private spaces. Charles and Paisley had been people leading ordinary lives, connected to a small town, embedded in routines and relationships that made them familiar to their neighbors.
Their deaths underscored the truth that danger often comes without warning, striking those who seem safest, and leaving nothing but questions in its wake. Investigators reflected on the pattern of the crime. 2 people shot multiple times in their own home, with no forced entry, no apparent motive, and no immediate suspects. The meticulous nature of the attack suggested forethought and familiarity. It was not random in execution, yet no discernible reason emerged to explain the extreme violence. The use of multiple shots, the apparent precision, and the absence of a stolen weapon all painted the portrait of someone determined, someone who had chosen to act decisively and then vanish without trace. The community of Los Lunas, while relatively tight-knit, offered the killer the anonymity that small towns can sometimes provide. Neighbors might see only glimpses of daily life, rarely noticing unusual activity or distress inside another person's home. The quiet streets, the modest separation between houses, and the general tendency for residents to respect privacy all created conditions in which a crime like this could occur without immediate observation. The killer had taken advantage of that environment, executing a crime that would remain unresolved for years. Family and friends of Charles and Paisley endured the emotional aftermath in ways that statistics and reports cannot capture. They confronted grief not only at the loss of life, but at the absence of justice, the inability to hold anyone accountable for a violent act that had taken place in what should have been a sanctuary. Daily life for them continued alongside an invisible weight, the knowledge that the person responsible remained free, somewhere in the community or beyond, carrying the truth locked away. Law enforcement maintained the case file with diligence, reviewing it as cold case protocols dictated. Each new lead, however slight, was cataloged, cross-referenced, and analyzed. Investigators revisited every interview, every forensic sample, and every piece of evidence that had been gathered from the scene. Yet, despite decades of effort, the case remained unsolved, a stark reminder of the limitations that even experienced detectives face when perpetrators leave no trace and motives remain obscure. The story of Charles and Paisley serves as an example of violence that is deeply personal, yet maddeningly opaque. It is an account of lives ended with extreme finality, of a home transformed into a site of tragedy, and of a community left with the knowledge that some actions occur without consequence. It is a narrative of both absence and presence, the absence of answers, the absence of accountability, and the persistent presence of grief and unanswered questions in the lives of those left behind. In Los Lunas, ordinary life continued. Children grew up, families carried on, neighbors maintained their routines. Yet somewhere in the community, the knowledge of that winter's events persisted. Someone, perhaps burdened, perhaps indifferent, knew exactly what had occurred in that home. That person knew who had pulled the trigger, why the act had been committed, and how the crime had been executed with such chilling precision. That knowledge, unshared, became a hidden dimension of the community, a secret silently coexisting with the everyday rhythm of life. The murders of Charles and Paisley highlight the unpredictability of human violence and the vulnerability of even seemingly secure environments. They illustrate how ordinary spaces, homes, neighborhoods, towns, can become the sites of extraordinary tragedy, leaving scars that endure long after the physical evidence has been collected and analyzed. Their deaths are a testament to the cruel randomness of some crimes, and the enduring consequences for those left behind. Though decades have passed, the case file continues to exist within the New Mexico State Police Cold Case Homicide Unit, a repository of unanswered questions, forensic records, witness statements, and investigative notes. It is a reminder that not every act of violence concludes with clarity, that not every mystery is resolved, and that for some families, the shadow of loss extends indefinitely.
Charles and Paisley's story remains incomplete, a narrative frozen in time, marking the boundaries between ordinary life and inexplicable tragedy. Ultimately, the tale of these murders is one of silence. Silence where answers should be. Silence where justice should have been served. Silence in place of understanding. The victims themselves cannot speak, and the person who committed the act has never come forward. The town continues, unchanged in its outward appearance. Yet the reverberations of that day continue in the memories of those connected to the victims. A constant reminder of the fragility of safety, the capriciousness of violence, and the enduring need for truth that has never been revealed. Somewhere, the truth of that winter day remains. It exists in the mind of the perpetrator, perhaps weighed down by conscience, perhaps carried with callous indifference. It is a secret embedded in human memory, a knowledge that might never be disclosed, leaving the families, the investigators, and the community with an unbroken circle of questions. Charles and Paisley's lives, their deaths, and the circumstances surrounding that quiet, tragic winter day remain part of New Mexico's shadowed narrative of unsolved homicides, a story without conclusion, a reminder that not all violence is explained, and not all justice is achieved. Brooklyn Griffin had been to the OK Casino more times than she could count. It wasn't the kind of place tourists stumbled into, or where gamblers chased fortune under chandeliers. No, it was small-town New Mexico, humble, quiet, and a little worn at the edges. The casino sat just north of Española in Rio Arriba County, a squat concrete island surrounded by endless desert and brittle sagebrush. From the highway, it looked almost plain, one story tall, with tired neon letters buzzing against the night sky. The parking lot stretched wider than seemed necessary, often half empty, the asphalt cracked and faded by years of heat. Still, for locals, it was a gathering spot, a place to sip watered-down cocktails, feed $20 bills into glowing machines, and pretend for a few hours that life held a little more luck than it really did. Brooklyn was 26, with a gentle laugh and a sensible streak. She worked evenings at a medical supply company in Santa Fe, 45 minutes to the south, and lived in a modest apartment with her roommate near the city's east side. On her nights off, she often drove north, up the winding roads, through the stretches of darkness, until the casino's neon sign flickered into view. She wasn't a high-stakes player or a regular fixture at the tables. Her friends said she'd take $20, maybe $40 if she felt lucky, and when it was gone, she'd stop. Brooklyn didn't chase losses. The thrill for her wasn't in winning. It was in the soft hum of slot machines, the clinking of coins, the faint scent of fried food drifting through the air. The casino was her way of pressing pause. On the night of March 14th, Brooklyn clocked out of work at 6:30 p.m. She texted her roommate, "Gonna stop by OK for a bit. Home before midnight." It was a Thursday night. Quiet, ordinary, and perfect for someone who preferred space to crowds. At 7:42 p.m., security footage captured her white Toyota Camry pulling into the south lot. She parked 3 rows from the entrance and walked toward the doors, the cool desert air brushing against her dark jeans and green jacket. The cameras showed her smiling at the security guard as she presented her ID. A brief exchange, polite and friendly. Then she stepped into the glittering noise of the casino floor. For the next 6 hours, Brooklyn's movements painted a calm and predictable routine. She played various slot machines near the center of the gaming floor, ordered a vodka cranberry from the bar at 9:15, and grabbed chicken tenders and fries from the quick-service cafe around 11:20. At 10:30, luck gave her a small gift, $87 on a Buffalo Gold machine. The footage showed her cashing out, folding the bills neatly, and slipping them into her purse. She seemed relaxed, at ease, not distracted, not followed. Just another Thursday night in northern New Mexico. At 1:35 a.m., Brooklyn cashed out her last $18 from a Wheel of Fortune machine. She then headed toward the south exit, stopping briefly at the restroom before leaving. At exactly 1:53 a.m., the security camera above the door caught her stepping into the night. Her purse was slung over her shoulder. She pushed through the glass doors and walked into the parking lot. That was the last time anyone ever saw her alive. The parking lot of the OK Casino would later become a riddle for investigators. Inside the building, hundreds of cameras watched every inch of the gaming floor, every cash cage, every hallway. But outside, where real danger often begins, there were only a handful of cameras focused on entrances and exits. None covered the open lot itself. Brooklyn's white Camry sat roughly 150 feet from the south doors. At her pace, it should have taken 90 seconds, 2 minutes at most, to reach the driver's side door, unlock it, and drive away. Yet, somewhere in that short walk between light and darkness, Brooklyn disappeared. By morning, her roommate realized something was wrong. Brooklyn hadn't come home, and her phone went straight to voicemail. That wasn't like her. She always kept it charged. By noon, after multiple unanswered calls, her roommate reached out to Brooklyn's parents in Albuquerque. Together, they filed a missing person report with Santa Fe police. Detectives moved quickly. Reviewing casino footage confirmed her arrival and departure times down to the second. Officers drove out to the OK Casino that same afternoon and located her car, still parked in the same spot, locked, untouched, silent under the midday sun. There were no signs of a struggle near the vehicle, no broken glass, no scattered belongings, no footprints that told a story. Her purse wasn't inside, nor was her jacket. Everything else appeared undisturbed. Police began interviewing casino staff and patrons who had been there that night. No one remembered seeing Brooklyn after she walked out. No one recalled any suspicious strangers. The casino handed over logs of registered guests and player card activity from that night, but the data wasn't much help. Most customers paid cash and left no digital trail. By the next morning, the investigation had drawn in the Rio Arriba County Sheriff's Office, New Mexico State Police, and eventually, the FBI's Albuquerque field office. Search and rescue teams spread out from the casino's perimeter, combing the high desert for any trace of Brooklyn. Locals from Espanola and nearby towns joined the effort, walking grid lines across the scrubland. The terrain was harsh, dry gullies, tangled brush, and narrow arroyos that twisted into the hills. For 3 days, there was nothing. Then, on the afternoon of March 17th, a volunteer searcher found something in a shallow arroyo 6.2 miles northeast of the casino. It was Brooklyn. She was lying face down, partially concealed by sagebrush. Her jeans were pulled down to her knees. Her green jacket was missing. There were cuts and bruises on her arms and hands. Defensive wounds, the coroner later said. Evidence of a desperate fight. Brooklyn had been shot twice. The first bullet entered her upper back, tearing through her right lung. The second, fired at closer range, struck the base of her skull and traveled upward. That was the fatal shot. Both were from a 9mm weapon, one of the most common handguns in America. The medical examiner estimated she died within minutes. The killer had fired from less than 10 feet away. Forensic teams collected everything they could. Skin cells beneath her fingernails, strands of hair not her own, fibers from her torn clothing. All of it was logged, sealed, and shipped to labs across the state for testing.
The results were crushing. No matches. The DNA didn't correspond to any known offender in state or federal databases. Investigators pieced together what they could from the evidence. Brooklyn hadn't been killed at the casino. She'd been taken, alive, from the parking lot, driven miles into the wilderness, and murdered there. Whoever did it knew the area well. The dirt road to that arroyo wasn't marked on most maps and would have been invisible to a stranger passing through. Brooklyn had fought back, hard. But whoever her attacker was, they had planned carefully. They left no tire tracks that could be tied to a specific vehicle. No shell casings. No footprints that survived the wind. Detectives theorized that Brooklyn had been approached just as she reached her car. Maybe someone asked for help, directions, or a jump start. Maybe they smiled. Maybe they looked harmless until they weren't. It would have taken only seconds. A gun pressed against her ribs, a quiet order to move. The night swallowing her cries before anyone heard. The timing was key. Nearly 2 a.m, late enough that the parking lot was mostly empty, but early enough that the few lingering patrons were still inside. The abduction had been quick, efficient, and silent. Police gathered footage from nearby roads and gas stations. They noted every car that left the casino between 1:50 and 2:15 a.m. Dozens were tracked down. None matched. The vehicle used to take Brooklyn away, if there was one visible at all, never appeared on any camera. The investigation widened to include Brooklyn's personal life. Detectives interviewed co-workers, friends, old boyfriends, and neighbors. They searched her phone records, bank statements, and social media for anything unusual. Nothing. Brooklyn's life was ordinary in the most painful way. No enemies. No risky habits. No hidden connections that made sense of what happened. And that, investigators would later say, was what made the case so terrifying. The randomness of Brooklyn's disappearance made it all the more chilling. If she hadn't been specifically targeted, then her abduction could have been committed by anyone. A man passing through the area. A casino patron who noticed her walking alone. Someone who had spent months planning. Or someone acting entirely on impulse. The possibilities were endless and terrifying. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed the case files. They constructed a profile of the likely perpetrator. Male, between 25 and 45 years old, familiar with the area around Espanola, and comfortable with violence. The calculated nature of the crime suggested someone organized. Someone able to seize control without hesitation, move a victim to a secondary location, and commit murder without leaving obvious evidence behind. The inclusion of sexual assault suggested prior offenses, though without a named suspect, this remained theoretical. State and federal investigators cross-checked known sex offenders in Rio Arriba, Santa Fe, and Los Alamos counties against the security footage and the evidence from Brooklyn's body. Tips from the public poured in. Sightings, suspicions, anonymous leads. Every tip was followed to its end, yet none yielded a breakthrough. The white Camry remained parked in the same place at the OK Casino that first morning, a silent sentinel marking the site of her final steps. Brooklyn's family refused to wait passively. Her parents established a reward fund, eventually raising $40,000 for information leading to an arrest. They appeared on local news programs, distributed flyers throughout the community, and maintained a social media presence dedicated to keeping the case alive. They lobbied local officials for improved lighting and security measures at casinos and in parking lots, hoping to prevent a repeat of the tragedy. Grief became action, but action could not bring Brooklyn back. Time passed, and the investigation's momentum slowed. Active leads disappeared. DNA evidence remains stored in state and federal databases, checked automatically against new profiles with the faint hope that one day, someone arrested for another crime might match the cells found under Brooklyn's fingernails. Yet no match came. The OK Casino itself changed after the tragedy. Cameras were installed to cover blind spots in the parking lot, including the path Brooklyn had walked that night. Security signs were posted, warning patrons to stay alert and request escorts after dark. Measures designed to protect future visitors arrived far too late for Brooklyn, but the memory of her disappearance endured. On March 14th, a young woman had walked out of the casino at 1:53 a.m. and vanished in 90 seconds of open asphalt and desert darkness. No witness, no clue, no immediate trace. Her killer, whoever they were, had entered the world's quiet spaces and left without a footprint large enough to follow. The crime became emblematic of how easily the ordinary can become horrific. Brooklyn had been enjoying a routine evening, playing slots, sipping a drink, cashing out small winnings. Her life was calm, unremarkable. And yet, that ordinariness made her vulnerable. She had walked alone into the night, thinking nothing of it. And that moment, invisible to the world, became the gateway to her death. For investigators, the case was maddening. It presented a paradox, a crime of opportunity executed with meticulous precision. Whoever had planned this assault had thought through every stage: the approach, the abduction, the transport, and the killing. The careful staging of the scene in the arroyo, partially hidden, far from main roads, made discovery less likely. And yet, they had failed to erase all evidence. Brooklyn's defensive wounds, her DNA, and the traces of the attacker's hair and fibers ensured that the possibility of future identification, though faint, remained. Her family, friends, and the law enforcement officers involved all struggled to reconcile the randomness of her selection with the calculated violence of her killer. There was no known motive, no tangible connection that explained why Brooklyn Griffin had been chosen. It wasn't a dispute, a revenge act, or an obvious crime of passion. The terror lay in the unknown, an anonymous predator, capable of committing violence without detection, wandering among the unsuspecting public. Years rolled by. Investigators reviewed the case repeatedly, hoping that new forensic methods might reveal fresh evidence. Cold case units analyzed old reports, revisited the crime scene, and re-examined witness accounts, but the mystery endured. The perpetrator could have left New Mexico, could be living quietly somewhere else, or could still roam the area, passing the OK Casino as if nothing had ever happened, carrying in their memory the details of that night and the final moments of Brooklyn Griffin. Her parents never stopped. They raised awareness in schools, community centers, and casinos. Flyers, social media posts, and news segments kept Brooklyn's image alive. They worked tirelessly to remind the public that in the middle of ordinary routines, unimaginable danger could strike, and that vigilance mattered. Meanwhile, the white Camry that had carried Brooklyn to the casino, the vehicle she would never drive again, returned to her family in Albuquerque. It was stored in a garage, untouched, frozen in time. A tangible reminder of the night an ordinary trip became a gateway to horror. It sat as a monument to loss, grief, and the unanswered questions that haunted her loved ones. The unanswered questions were perhaps the cruelest part. Why had Brooklyn left the casino at that precise moment? Had she been approached by a stranger? Could she have somehow sensed the danger? Investigators could only guess. The 90 seconds between the casino doors and her car had been enough to erase certainty, to create a chasm between life and death, between presence and absence. Even the landscape seemed complicit. The desert, quiet and empty in daylight, hides shadowed corridors and secluded arroyos where crimes can remain undiscovered for days, weeks,
or longer. That night, the parking lot was well lit and open, yet invisible threats lurked. The desert's openness offered no protection, only the illusion of safety. Despite the passage of time, the horror of the act remained potent. Brooklyn's abduction and murder were a reminder that in familiar places thought to be routine and safe, violence could erupt in an instant. The randomness, the precision, and the silence of the crime left investigators, her family, and the public unsettled. The case became emblematic of the fragility of ordinary life when confronted by unseen predators. Brooklyn's killer had acted with a terrifying efficiency, erasing themselves from immediate detection while leaving subtle markers for future investigation. The bullet wounds, the defensive scratches, the disarrayed clothing. These small details were the only evidence of the struggle that had taken place, the only testament to the human violence hidden behind the quiet exterior of a desert night. To this day, no one knows the full truth. Brooklyn's murderer remains a ghost in the records, a profile without a face, a shadow in the lives of everyone connected to the case. The law enforcement agencies involved continue to monitor the evidence, cross-check DNA databases, and revisit witness statements, hoping for a breakthrough that might bring justice. The OK Casino, meanwhile, continues to operate. Patrons come and go, oblivious to the darkness that passed over the lot in those crucial 90 seconds. Lights flash, coins clink, and slot machines hum as if the past had never intruded on the present. Yet for those who remember Brooklyn Griffin, the memory remains vivid. A young woman vanished without warning, taken from the safety of light into a shadowed, remote world where violence was absolute and irreversible. The case serves as a haunting reminder. Sometimes horror is not folklore, not legend, not a story whispered around a campfire. Sometimes it is real, unexplainable, and existing quietly behind the mundane rhythms of daily life. It is the terrifying truth that even in a well-lit parking lot, surrounded by neon, concrete, and other people, a person can be taken in a moment. Brooklyn's story endures as a warning. The 90 seconds she walked from the casino to her car were enough to change everything. Those who study her case know that ordinary places can hide extraordinary evil. The randomness, the efficiency, and the absolute silence of the crime ensure that her killer remains at large. Perhaps only a few miles from where it all began, perhaps long gone, but certainly carrying the memory of what was done. Her parents continue to speak her name, to demand answers, to remind the world that Brooklyn Griffin existed, that she was loved, and that her life, though brutally taken, matters. They have transformed grief into advocacy, action into hope. And yet, the absence of closure is a wound that remains. The white Camry sits quietly in Albuquerque, a frozen symbol of the night the ordinary became horrifying. The parking lot, once mundane, is now forever shadowed by memory. The case file grows with reports, lab results, and interviews, but it holds no culprit. Brooklyn Griffin's murder remains a haunting, unresolved chapter in the desert of northern New Mexico, a place where light does not guarantee safety, and where 90 seconds can alter everything. Some questions, it seems, have no answers. Some horrors are too carefully executed to leave a trail. Brooklyn's abduction and murder remain a chilling testament to the invisible dangers that inhabit ordinary life. The desert stretches on, the casino hums and glows, and the 90 seconds between the door and the car continue to echo, a stark reminder that the darkness can be closer, faster, and more deliberate than anyone realizes. And so, the case of Brooklyn Griffin remains open. The investigation persists. The cameras, the forensic evidence,
and the tips wait patiently for the day when justice might finally arrive. Until then, her story remains a shadow, a warning, and a mystery, reminding us that even in the brightest places, unseen horrors may lurk, ready to strike when least expected.